Katina. Welcome to the Fruition podcast. Thank you so much
Hi.
for being here with me today.
Thank you so much for having me. I am so excited for this chat and to catch up. I feel like we've had this for a long time coming.
Yeah. And I'm like starstruck. I'm so obsessed with all of your content. It's so informative. That's what I love.
Yeah, that makes me so happy to hear. And thank you so much. I am definitely someone who spends a lot of time on TikTok, more than I probably should myself. And I feel like I am never personally motivated to make change unless I understand why we need to.
And it's helpful with these little steps that you suggest too, because they're everyday habits that you can incorporate into your
Yeah.
life in like a couple of minutes or just in shifting your perspective during something that you're already doing, which are easy to kind of blow off because you're like,
Yeah.
what's the big deal? Like if I am more present on my walk or if I don't listen to anything on my walk, like what difference is it going to make? But you explain how impactful it really can be. And I just think
Yeah.
that's so powerful.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Well, I think that the world that we live in is so much about buying things and trying to continuously improve ourselves. And I don't think that's really how science and well-being works, right?
Yeah.
Like it's a series of micro changes that we have to make in order to actually change our life writ large. And we can't necessarily just take a pill or, go on a trip or
Yeah.
go meditate in the mountains in order to change who we are at the
Yeah.
core. So although
Totally.
it might not be as enticing at first, it has the most impact.
Yeah.
And I'm excited for all of us as a society and as a community to be able to start like caring for those things more.
Yes. Like so excited to get your perspective on all these different topics. But to
Yeah.
introduce you to anybody listening who hasn't been stalking you for ages now, you are the founder of On Adulting, which is a blog that you started that you nurtured a community of over 100,000 people, which is massive. And you evolved that into a book. And then you actually published a book by the same title, On Adulting: How Millennials Can Work Less, Live More, and Bend the Rules for Good. Check. Like,
Yes.
sign me up for all of those things. And you're the co founder and chief well-being officer, which dream title, of Daydreamers, which is this incredible app that I've become a member of recently and am engaging with you on. And it's so useful, and I can see how it's really going to have a huge impact of my life. And the core tenet of this app and this membership is to help people be more human and less robot. So I am really excited to learn more from you. You are a clinical psychologist as well, so you understand and explain the science behind everything that you're recommending, which
Yeah.
I just love that you'll be able to share from a scientific perspective why some of these concepts are so important to implement in your life. It seems like writing is your thing, and you've been featured in Fast Company, Time, Health, Vox, Teen Vogue, Mind Body Green, like all of these
Yeah.
publications that I've been obsessed with for years.
I love that you picked up that writing is this common thread for me. And um, I think it's actually a core tenet of my story that I really never thought that I could write after I was like in high school. Um, I ended up going to an undergraduate business program at NYU where we were kind of funneled into doing math, going into finance, and kind of working in kind of this typical business realm. And really growing up, I grew up as a first gen immigrant to a family that was very much working class and, always striving for uh, more levels of success, quote unquote.
Mhm.
And I only had thought about writing as this childhood pastime. And it wasn't until I was really like in the depths of burnout in my first job that I returned to it as a personal habit, and then something that I even allowed myself to dream about doing as a career years later.
Mhm.
So I think it's really fascinating and cool how much can change in such a short period of time. But I think it speaks so much to a lot of what we'll talk about today, which is about creativity and how we can kind of start to change our perception of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to hear a bit more about that first generation
Yeah.
immigrant mentality and how your family viewed creativity and understandably prioritized some of those other fields that you were just mentioning, math, finance, and more linear paths that we'll talk about that had more of a formula to success. It makes sense that they would want to come to a country, the land of opportunity, and take
Yeah.
advantage of, the security that seems to be available through those paths. So I'm just curious, what did your childhood feel like in that sort of environment when it came to creativity and education? You said that you wrote, but then stopped at a certain point. So
Yeah.
what was your mentality around that?
Yeah, it's such a good question. When I was growing up, my mom was luckily a stay-at-home mom, and my dad worked in the restaurant industry. So he, started as a dishwasher, kind of ended up working up, managing some restaurants, and then ultimately owning a place when I was, in college. So I grew up with a family who really prioritized stability, kind of a very different career path than both of my parents had, which was late nights, kind of family business, and really not necessarily knowing how that could turn into at least financial stability. So when I was growing up, I did a lot of creative things. I was an opera singer,
Oh my
surprisingly.
gosh.
I know
That's
how
hardcore.
random. Yeah, it was very hardcore. I always wish that I could have been a like cool pop singer, but my voice was like from the 1800s, so it definitely skewed a lot more towards soprano. But anyway, I did that intensely growing up. I did dance intensely growing up. And I loved kind of theater and being able to mesh the two through that. And those were like my outlets. Also, I did a lot of sports as well. So those were just kind of things that I did in high school as a way to kind of keep me fulfilled and happy. But there was no part of my childhood where it was ever discussed that that could be something I could pursue,
Mm-hmm.
even though I loved it, even though I, like won these awards for it. There was really no way that I thought that I could do that as a job. So I knew that I was going to take this very kind of traditional path and study business, which was even outside the realm of what my parents ultimately wanted, which was, to go into law or something
Mm.
even more stable. And for most of college, I internally rebelled against it, but
Mm.
knew that I would end up likely falling into one of the typical pathways, of which I did. I ended up working at an investment bank out of school. And we can get into how I felt there, but I really kind of let go of pretty much all of my creative loves when I entered college.
Mm. After you graduated and you were going into the workforce, were you philosophizing on any of this, or were you
Yeah.
just kind of heads down? I mean, when you went to NU, you were on a merit-based scholarship, and then you graduated a year early, so you were
Yeah.
probably just focused and busy.
Yeah.
Were you thinking beyond your day-to-day execution
Yeah.
and getting things done?
So it's really fascinating. I can share a little bit of that part of my story. But when I got to NYU, there was this like, they literally called it an underground network of people
Oh,
who,
I
yeah,
like the sound of that.
I was weirded out by it, but I still dove headfirst into it. Of this community of people who were pushing forward what we now know as social impact, right? So they were
Mm.
trying to understand, where does business and business responsibilities lie for community, society, the world. It was the very nascent days of climate change work and environmental sustainability work within organizations, thinking about mental health and well-being. And there were so many fascinating people and professors who were thinking deeply about this.
Mhm.
And I was part of that group when I was an undergrad, which I think informed a lot of the work that I ended up doing in my career. I thought of that as my like hobby in school,
Yeah.
but it's interesting because I ended up going on to do that work, at some point at Goldman, which is where I was in my first role, and then my next role after that at a philanthropic venture fund. That being said, and I think just to kind of summarize that a little bit, we did a lot of critical, deep thinking in that community, which I think was really missing from a lot of my like formal education. So it really had me kind of starting to think about, what does impact mean? How can I personally make an impact? How can I join an organization or think more broadly about starting a company or doing something that combines things that people care about, which is, in a capitalistic society, business, and the ways that we can actually, improve the world. So I kind of left college thinking about that deeply and ended up, as you said, graduating a semester early. And instead of going to work straight away like some of my peers, I decided to go backpack in Australia and New Zealand.
Oh my
So
gosh.
yeah, I took
Amazing.
my very meager savings for my summer internship and said, like, I am just going to head off with one backpack. And
Wow.
yeah, like traveled around for a couple of months
By
and
yourself?
yeah, by myself.
Wow.
Um, and literally just like lived off of buses, met a ton of people. And I would say that was probably the most transformative experience that I had leading into the rest of my career. And the reason for that is because coming from obviously the family that I did, the school that I did, and then the workplace that I knew I was heading into, the emphasis was on this very extrinsic version of success, right? How much money can you make? How much, what can you buy with that? Like, what are you going to do to prove to the world that you are successful?
Yeah.
And I don't know if you've spent a lot of time in New York, but I think that's very much how the city is organized. But when I got to Australia and New Zealand, I was eating like, the same rice bag that I had bought at the supermarket for weeks, and was surrounded by people who were really had no life plan. They were just, traveling and enjoying and living their life to truly what felt like the fullest. And I think it just rocked my perspective of what happiness looked like, what success looked like, and really allowed me to start to question what I wanted in my life. So that is the like pre-adult honeymoon I like to say that I took before entering this very corporate world just a couple of weeks after I got back. And it led to some really hard but interesting reflections.
Yeah, I bet. But that's so eye-opening to recognize that, like you said, those extrinsic measurements that we're using to determine our status and whether or not we've made it or where we are on that track of making
Yeah.
it are not even considered by so many people in the rest of the world who are experiencing so much deep meaning and fulfillment in their lives. I mean, it was probably so obvious to you that all of those measures are completely disconnected from what you're feeling in your day to day. And it probably really got you thinking
Yeah.
that there's got to be something to that and that there's got to be another way or somewhere in between. That's what I thinking about or facing in my own life, that I don't really want to be on either end of the spectrum. I want something in between. And where is that fine balance where like you can enjoy the fruits of some of the systems that we have in place in our Western world? I mean, in capitalism, to put it
Yeah.
frankly, but then also recognizing that like you don't have to sacrifice your soul and that you can actually adopt some of these practices and lifestyles and tools and mentalities, I guess. And I'm kind of struggling with like, where is that in between? Knowing that you were going to one of the most regimented work
Yeah.
environments out there and like harsh, a very structured, very intense environment, how were
Yeah.
you kind of grappling with this commitment that you had already made to Goldman
Yeah,
and your new understanding of what could be possible in your life.
totally. I mean, it was a very, I think many of us can relate to this now because when we go through major identity transitions and changes, everything feels murky, right? So you
Mm-hmm.
really don't know what is true anymore. And I would say that period in time for me was very much reestablishing a lot of truths. And that was the first time, probably, besides going to college, that I was forming a new version of my identity in such a major way. I think going back to something that you were saying about balance, what really was the most fascinating realization I had traveling around in Australia and New Zealand was I had done, a lot of travel. My dad grew up in a very small village in Greece with no
Mm.
shoes. We went there every
Wow.
summer. There was like no running water. So
Wow.
we grew up with like a lot of that. But what I think was really interesting is that when I was traveling around, a lot of people were actively choosing that life. They weren't just trying to get away from something, right? They were like, this is what is fulfilling me and bringing me joy in this moment. It might not be forever, but like, who cares? I'll decide when it feels better to me to change it. And it's interesting. I feel like I could almost caricature myself back then, but I traveled around with a notebook, like writing out exactly when I was going to the next place. Like I was the most type A anxious person ever. Like if it rained, I was like, no, I'm missing out on this one time I could ever
Mm-hmm.
do XYZ activity. And I think it really allowed me to see that not everything is an evolution in life,
Mm-hmm.
right? And we are just making these choices based on the identity that we have right now and the values that we
Mm-hmm.
have at this given time. And I think that was a really liberating realization going into this new, intense, space where there were a lot of expectations. And I felt really lucky that I had the awareness to go into that and being able to make the choice of what was most important to me in that moment. What I
Interesting.
chose for the year and a half, 2 years that I worked at Goldman was that I wanted to learn as much as possible from people who clearly did something right. Like they, as much as everyone really hates on Goldman, which is very understandable, it is a really interesting place to work because people there are extremely driven to do their best.
Mm-hmm.
And whatever that could mean, that might not
Mm-hmm.
be on the best things, but I do think it was a very cool place to start my career, even though I really disliked a lot of the content that I was doing because it instilled a lot of values of um, what was most important, how to get that done, and how to make choices about prioritization and kind of doing things to the best caliber that you can. So I made an active choice in that time. Like, I know I'm
Yeah.
going to dislike this, but I'm going to do my best here,
Okay.
and try to get as much out of it. And then when that time was not right anymore, I actively looked for something else,
Yeah.
which I could share more about.
That's so interesting that you had this experience where you understood more about fulfillment, meaning, and your values. And then immediately following that, you had the opposite experience of understanding what it takes to really excel and perform and achieve.
Yeah.
And I'm sure it was a really fascinating,
Yeah.
shift in your perspective, and to be able to take a step back from it all and pick and choose pieces from each to kind of create your own recipe of what you want for your own life must have been like the ultimate masterclass
Yeah.
for setting up your next steps or what you thought of your future. Just the opportunity to have that higher perspective and awareness during it all so that you can really disassociate from the validation that a lot of people are seeking by going to work at Goldman.
Yeah.
You could really get from it exactly what you needed. That's so, so interesting. So, how did you feel when you were there?
Yeah, I love the way that you frame that. And I think what's really interesting, coming back to the thread in the beginning of our conversation, the way that I was able to do that was through writing all the time. I took a notebook everywhere with me, on the subway, at work. I would like find a little corner and be like, I can no longer sit at my 3-screen computer anymore.
Yeah.
I must take a writing break. And it was really the way that I stayed connected with myself and what was most important to me, obviously, among other things, but I think that was probably the main way that I was able to do that. I would say that when I was at Goldman, I was very, and I don't mean this lightly, naive. Like, I really thought that I individually could make an impact and change on this organization.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the most beautiful things of being a young person. And that's why I like, even only 10 years later, I get so much energy from people who are just getting out of college and into this like system that exists, that all of us adults kind of just end up, whether we like it or not, entering. And I think what was really cool about that time, and that was when I started writing on adulting privately, was questioning the things that people accepted to be true. Like, why are you sacrificing your child's soccer game to stay late to work on this presentation? That feels so odd. And so all I did that time was almost look at it as a journalist, I guess, and think about like, these are the accepted things to be true. And this is what I will not tolerate as a human being.
Yeah.
So all of my time there felt very much like I was immersing myself in an experience that I was trying my best to figure out what I did not want in my next phase of life.
Oh,
It was
that's
really
so interesting.
interesting.
You must have been having aha after aha.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
I heard too, I mean, just through what you've posted and what you've written and how you've spoken in other conversations, that you were feeling pretty worn out.
Yeah.
And a word that you've mentioned a couple of times is languish. And so I would love to hear, just from your perspective as a psychologist, like
Yeah.
what is languishing, and what is this idea that so many people are accepting languishing in their life?
Totally. That I would say is probably the biggest, if I were like looking back on my notes at the time, that I personally was experiencing and unaware of, and also that everyone around me was experiencing and not talking about. So, to kind of define what languishing is, when we think about mental health, it isn't just mental illness or the absence of mental illness, right? So a lot of times when we think of the word mental health, we typically associate it with things like depression or anxiety or OCD, right? But what has been this really powerful shift in the mental health space over the past decade or a little bit more is that we've started to broaden what it means to be mentally healthy. And true mental health sits on the other side of our mental health spectrum, which looks like flourishing and thriving and reaching your full potential, right? That being said, when we are kind of in this middle stage where we're not experiencing kind of the depths of burnout, the depths of depression, we're, not clinically diagnosed with mental illness, but we are not reaching that full spectrum and side of mental health, we're sitting right in the middle at something called the languishing. So this is where we actually have the biggest risk of developing a mental illness. And oftentimes, I always love referencing Adam Grant wrote a really viral piece about this in 2021 in the New York Times, and he called it feeling blah. It's when nothing in your life feels exciting or energizing. You're not necessarily like exhausted and completely at the end of your, stress limit, which is what we experience when we're burned out. But it's when nothing in your life is motivating you towards a future and you kind of feel like you're just living this very robotic, repetitive version of your day to day. which I think many of us can relate to, sadly. And that is definitely, you know, what I was experiencing, probably even more levels of stress than that when I was at Goldman. But I think it's something that having a word for it is deeply important to be able to start to heal from.
Totally, totally. Because that state, it's just really easy to ignore it and to fall
Yeah.
into this cycle, which I'm sure gets worse and worse and worse as you don't address it. But
Yeah.
it's an easy state to accept and live with because you can still get through your day to day. Like you're still getting your work done, you're still seeing your friends and doing things, but you're not feeling as deeply as you could feel. Like you're fuzzy. I guess if people who are in this state that aren't totally burnt out to the point where they need to quit their job or take leave or really address it, but they're not flourishing and they're in this in between languishing space, how do they begin to take steps out of that when it might feel in that place like adding another hobby or another chore would just add stress?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Well, this is the conundrum of the way that our world works and also the solution, right? So what's really fascinating is that this area has gotten a lot of focus over the past couple of years. I think especially because of COVID, and it's actually a lot of what we focus on at Daydreamers. But what's really interesting is there are two outcomes from a lot of the research. The first is adding in activities that are enjoyable to your day-to-day, even if it feels like you don't have any time or space for it. The reason for that is twofold. First, a lot of times when we're languishing, we actually like miscalculate the way that we spend our time. So I have experienced this many times myself. But we'll feel like our days are extremely busy, but we're spending 2 hours scrolling on TikTok, right? When we look at actually how people spend their time versus what they say they're feeling and how they feel their time is being spent, it doesn't line up. And the second thing is that when we actually add enjoyable activities into our day and take it, even if that means taking out things that are kind of bringing you down, like replacing those activities, or if you're like literally squeezing them in and making new time, the research finds that you actually feel like you have more time when you're adding activities into your life. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that, but what is most interesting to me is that we demonize joy and enjoying ourselves, right? And when we look at it from a scientific perspective, enjoyment is one of the core ways that we improve our health and our happiness. There's even studies where people, like doctors, literally send their patients to laughter therapy.
Oh my gosh, I want to go. That
I
sounds
know.
fun.
I know. There's like true clinical research on the impact of fun and laughter and enjoyment.
Wow.
Yeah, on reducing inflammation in our body. Like it's actually really crazy the impact that it can have. So that's one side of things. The other side of things is this concept of flow, right? So we've heard a lot about getting into the flow state, and I don't know about you, but whenever I hear this, I always associate it with like email companies, like companies that are trying to like help me be more productive. And they're like, the best way to be more productive is to get into a flow state while you are typing up the 50 emails on your to-do list, which is not true from a scientific perspective, right? But one of the ways that we really heal from languishing is by being fully immersed in a task that we enjoy. And that is truly what flow state is defined as. And there was actually some really interesting research that we talk about a lot at Daydreamers, but that came out during COVID, and it looked at people who did a couple variety of different well-being activities during their time, like meditating or nostalgia or thinking about being optimistic about the future, or flow-based creative activities. And they found the people by far who had the best well-being outcomes, were the most well-adjusted, were the ones who got into the true flow state. And that's because we are unable to think of anything else. Like think about any time where you have just been fully immersed in doing something that you enjoy, your prefrontal cortex actually isn't thinking about the future. It isn't thinking about the email that you have to send. It isn't worrying about kind of what happened in a meeting.
It almost feels like it's offline. Like, not that I'm sure that from a scientific perspective, you can't think of anything else, but also I'm disassociated with that part of my brain that would think of something else.
Exactly. That's exactly it. And what's really powerful about that is we don't have a lot of times in our world where we actually are able to completely disconnect, right? And a lot of the well-being activities that we tend towards are like trying to remove all the thoughts from our brain and like be completely silent by actively trying to do that, or reflecting on all the things that are wrong, right? Which is great and powerful in some regards, but sometimes we do need to just like tune out. That's why yoga classes can feel so good, because you're like fully immersed without worrying about your phone. So yeah, I would say those two major elements: making more time, even if you don't feel like it, like you have it, and doing something that really allows you to get into the flow, even if it's only for a few minutes, are the two ways that we start to lay the groundwork for getting out of languishing and into the more flourishing ways of being, which is curiosity and wonder and awe and creativity and connection. All of the things that we completely lose touch with when we're in this languishing state.
Okay, interesting. So a couple of things that I just heard you say. One, your flow state can end up being only a couple of minutes. I guess in my mind, I've always thought like it takes a long time to get into a flow state, and then you have to be in it a long time for it to be effective. But you just said even for a couple of minutes, that can have a huge impact on your overall well-being. So that's just really helpful to know. But it sounds like you were also saying it might feel a little stressful at first, like making the time for those activities, squeezing it in, however you want to approach it, might be a little bit stressful if you're in that blah state and feel like you're on autopilot. Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah.
I think both of those things are really great takeaways. Number one, it doesn't need to be for a long period in time. The research shows it takes about 15 minutes to get into a flow state.
Wow.
And even just entering it starts to, we say send your brain on this positive upward spiral, allow you to start to feel happier and notice more positive things. So just 15 minutes or so allows you to start to feel that way.
Interesting.
So number one is doing it for less time more frequently is really powerful. Think about if you were, trying to go running more often, you wouldn't only do it once a month or once a year. You would try to do it for shorter periods of time, once or twice a week, right?
Okay.
And similar to running or similar to any type of well-being or physical activity even, it is annoying at first. Like it is not fun to change the pathways in our brain. Our brain is meant to make our lives as easy as possible. So when we're building these new pathways, any habit, it takes a lot of effort and a lot of energy. But I think that there's a difference between kind of efforting for efforting's sake, right? That constant achievement, and being able to feel accomplished with something that you are intrinsically motivated to do, you're excited about, and also is going to allow you to feel better.
And these tools are building a foundation for you to have a lasting or make a lasting change on your overall life. And so it's not like earlier in our conversation, you mentioned going on a vacation or taking some sort of drastic action or the instant gratification. But
Totally.
and that's great in the moment, and sometimes you need that too. Like sometimes you need immediate relief, and that's massively beneficial to give yourself that space. But these smaller steps day to day shift your mind to feel more open and see new possibilities and see new pathways that will make really tiny, incremental, longer lasting changes on your overall lifestyle. So
Yeah.
it's like slowly course correcting yourself
Yeah.
into a whole new, better feeling life. And the other thing that I pulled away from what you said a minute ago is that you don't have to languish your life away. Like
Yeah.
you can feel thriving and flourishing. You can feel all those things. And do you think that that's actually a natural state for humans? Like, is that something that's achievable for everybody to feel like they're flourishing and thriving? Or,
Totally.
okay, yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people, I mean, myself included at certain points, believe that they have to accept this languishing because that's life, that's adulting,
Yeah.
that's reality. And maybe a lot of people around you at Goldman accepted that as well. Like that's
Yes.
just the way it is. Like welcome to the real world. But personally, like
Yeah.
I can't live with that.
Yeah.
And like I reject the idea that you have to languish or suffer.
Totally. You brought up so many interesting points. Number one, yes, that going back to kind of when I first started questioning these things, the main question I had is like, why is feeling this way the accepted truth of our
Yeah.
society? Like, I don't get it. I don't agree with it. And I am going to like take in all the reasons why everyone is doing this, even though I felt that way myself, and then figure out ways to change, not just for myself, but
Mm-hmm.
hopefully for many other people. And what I found through my own personal experience, and then later on why I went to grad school, was to really understand what does it mean to thrive, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
how do we get to do that? Why aren't we doing that right now? And what are the steps to getting there collectively? And I think what's really interesting is that our brains function. I really like to use this analogy, and it was from one of my professors in grad school, because I think it paints such a great picture of how emotions work in our brain. So essentially, people may have heard this before, but negative emotions have much more weight than positive ones. The reason for that is because when we were evolving, many hundreds of thousands of years ago, we needed to survive, running away from animals, eating
Mm-hmm.
certain berries. And when we had a bad experience, felt badly, we needed to actually take action. So that's the reason why negative emotions stick around with us for longer. And the comparison is that negative emotions are like rocks. Positive emotions, on the other hand, are like feathers. We need a lot more of them to outweigh one rock.
So
And
interesting.
yeah, when we understand that to be true, that helps us understand why we need to actively document, savor, collect positive emotions, because we need them to feel just as real and heavy as negative ones. That being said, going back to your question, are like humans meant to flourish? There's this really amazing research paper by this woman, Dr. Barbara Fredrickson, that's about this positive upward spiral that I've mentioned a few times. And what she and her research team found is like, are we wired for positive emotions? And really, their research showed that we are, and we have been since the beginning of humanity. And when we are able to collect positive resources, that's like being able to cooperate with others, being able to give something to others in our tribe or our group, we actually survive better. So we are really wired to look for these positive things. And when we document and savor these positive emotions, our brain starts to help us look for more positive ones. So we don't have to do all the work to kind of collect all these feathers. Our brain is helping us do so. So I would say we, are wired for both, but I think that there is a lot going on in our brains and bodies that helps us flourish and thrive, and we're made to do it.
That's so interesting. No one ever talks about being wired for positive thoughts
Yeah.
also. Like all you
Yeah,
ever hear is our survival instincts
I
and why
know.
we think this way.
And I think what's really interesting, even specifically around some like flourishing emotions and human traits, like creativity, curiosity, awe, wonder, these are all core to humanity, right? They're like innate parts of ourselves that we have lost touch with in the way that our world works, and ultimately are like protective mechanisms to help us feel our best, do our best, and connect more broadly with ourselves and others. So I think
Wow.
that like we often think of those as, at least I did for a very long time, think that they're these lucky experiences that we get to have if we're talented, or we live in a beautiful place and we get to like see a sunset over a mountain every night. But they actually are things that happen in these very everyday parts of being human. And I think we just have to like change the conversation around them, because the scientific research is
Totally.
there.
And retrain your brain too. That's the other thing
Yeah.
that I've learned is it might not be natural depending on, how you grew up or who you grew up around or the environment, whatever it might be. Like, again, it's uncomfortable at first when you
Yeah.
notice, oh, wow, a lot of my thoughts are negative. There is this uncomfortable period of forcing yourself to notice or forcing yourself to hold that commentary back, maybe, and instead replace it with an uncomfortable feeling positive thought or comment. But
Yeah.
it's in that discomfort and practice that you start rewiring your brain, and then it becomes more natural, and then you don't have to think about it.
Totally. And that process is exactly what it's like to build new pathways in our brain. That's neuroplasticity, our
Mm-hmm.
ability to change and strengthen and rewire our brain over time. And
Yeah.
for a long time, scientists thought that we were unable to do that after a certain age, like around 25.
Yeah.
They thought, and we've probably heard this in society, right? Like, you can't change your habits as you get
Yeah.
older, but really, we must do that. We're totally capable of it. And the reason that we must do it is because it's core to our longevity. Like, if we stop learning and stop challenging ourselves and just get stuck in our habits as we age, our brain actually deteriorates faster. So really starting to change your habits more consistently, use alternative hands. That's why I'm so passionate about everyday creativity, because it's constantly rewiring your brain. That's like the whole
Yeah.
point of what creative practice does. So it's extremely important for us to be uncomfortable and like see it as a gift that our brain is doing what it's meant to do, and
Yeah.
strengthening and protecting us as we age.
So you were at Goldman for about 2 years, is what you said.
Yeah.
You were experiencing that languishing, you were witnessing languishing and burnout, but
Yes.
you got out.
Got
So
out.
how did you were writing and you were blogging. Were you starting to see success with your blog at that point? And so it kind of gave you confidence, or how did you make that transition to your next step, which was a more socially oriented venture fund?
Yeah, so I actually wasn't writing publicly at that time. I
Oh,
was
okay.
doing like the OG version of blogging, which was like writing in a Word document and then sharing it on an email list with friends and family. That was
I
literally,
love that.
if this gives anyone hope, that's what I was doing for like a year. I was definitely too scared to share it publicly, and I'm glad that I had a lot of time to really work through my own emotions with a like safe group of feedback.
Yeah.
I'm sure my friends and family did not enjoy nor read like all of slash any of them. I ended up connecting with an old professor of mine. I was really passionate at that time about social impact and had started working on Goldman's environmental sustainability team, which was quite new at the time. So I was able to transition into something that I was actually really excited about, but not the environment for me. And then ended up being able to get a job at this really cool philanthropic venture fund in New York that was both incubating and funding social impact organizations, nonprofits that cared and were making an impact on mental health and digital learning and education. So it fit right in the area that I was really passionate about. And while I was there and being able to feel a lot more fulfilled in my work and way less stressed in my work environment.
Space.
Yeah. I, in my excess space, started blogging publicly. And just did it like under a pseudonym at the time. I was really not confident sharing my work. And I would recommend that to anyone who wants to share and create, but isn't sure like if they're want to actually be known for something yet. It's a really wonderful way to just be able to like build up your confidence. And then I started seeing a lot of traction with that. It was still like early days of blogging. But I was doing that full time for like a year and a half, probably, until I ended up working on adulting full time. I ended up applying on a whim to this graduate program that I had been eyeing for a long time. But felt like it was a really interesting time for me to do it. And the day that I submitted the final draft of my book, I got an email that I got accepted into this program, which was such a wild and very like universe moment that I was kind of closing one chapter and moving on to another one, which was really beautiful.
Wow. That's incredible. So validating.
Yeah. And I think what's really cool is the writing process for me, and what a lot of unadulting did. And I think anyone who blogs or writes about their personal journey knows this, is you reach a certain point where you know that you can't be the only one who is experiencing these things. And a lot of what my purpose was in wanting to understand and go back to graduate school was really looking at it from a large scale view. Like these personal experiences that I was having, I was one dot, but can we really start to make kind of broad, massive change based on science and research, and really being able to validate a lot of personal experiences I saw people were having. So that's what drew me to going to studying clinical psychology and really taking the approach of looking at creativity, specifically creative expression and purpose and fulfillment.
Yeah. And it's not a new problem.
Yeah.
But I do think that it gets parsed out generationally
Totally.
in some odd way. And it's something that us millennials, I think, called out because like the systems that worked for the generation that preceded us, like they were rewarded for operating within that system. And I think that our generation realized that the system isn't necessarily working in the way that it used to. And so our expectations weren't being met per se. And it wasn't working out for us. And so we started to push back on it. And I'm curious, from all this research that you've done and then your own experience too, like, a lot of people say we're lazy as millennials, we don't want to work. And then they say that about Gen Z also. And I don't think that that's true at all. A few things that have come up that I've just seen in the zeitgeist is like the age of anti-ambition. And you've mentioned that before, and you've talked about that, and like the great resignation, and that we just don't want to work. What do you think of that generational difference? Like, what came to the surface for us that caused this?
Well, I think one headline that I would say is that any group that does not conform to the norm, it's our human nature to push that away, right? We are looking for conformity, and the science of nonconformity, of innovation, is so interesting. But I would say that it makes sense that we're told that we're lazy, or kind of push away this message that detracts from what we are kind of accepting in our society now. That being said, something that is really interesting is that the changes that we are making as a generation, and the questions that we're asking, and the way that we're redefining or pushing to redefine work and priorities and values, is not just important for us, it's deeply important for all generations. And something that we see at Daydreamers, even on the smallest scale, is our hypothesis was that the people who are going to be drawn to working on their creative health and healing from burnout and languishing were going to be millennials, in their 30s that experience the workforce and are at a point where they're ready to make change.
Mm-hmm.
And that just isn't true at all. We have people from all ages, and a large population is people who are 55 plus,
I love
who,
that.
yeah, it's amazing, who are entering this new stage of life, who have done all of the right things. And, they've bought the house, they've had their kids, they've raised them, they have retirement, and they're still unfulfilled. They don't know how to spend their time, what their identity is. So I think that these questions are deeply important, and they haven't been solved in our society. We just are the ones that are being forced to grapple with them. And I think we're doing so in a really important and big way. And I think that saying things like we have no ambition, that's totally fine. Maybe we need to redefine what ambition is, right?
Totally. Yeah, I completely agree with that. And there's so many things that have kind of been pushed at us, the need for constant productivity, the need to strive as far and as high as you possibly can, and girl bossing, and all of these, just try harder.
Yeah.
Do better.
Yeah.
Kind of phrases and ideas and concepts. And the interesting place to be as a millennial is we're wondering, is it safe to break out of this system? Where would that put me? Am I going to be able to take care of myself if I really push back on this? Whereas Gen Z is we don't care.
Yeah.
We'll figure it out. I love that you're questioning some of these things like ambition, because it's kind of taboo to say that maybe we don't want to be ambitious, or maybe we don't need to girl boss, maybe we don't need to be productive. It's not like we don't want to evolve, and we don't want to continue to be curious and continue to learn and continue to create and find solutions, offer solutions to society. We want to further society.
Totally.
But we don't have to do it with this pushing feeling behind it.
I think I couldn't agree with everything you're saying more. And I also think that we're seeing it doesn't work. It straight up doesn't work. When we look at it scientifically, it is so core to our productivity, even if we want to take the most productive view, that we need rest in order to show up as our best and most productive and most focused self. There have been countless studies recently that show I just shared this on TikTok, sitting in back-to-back meetings with no breaks increases the levels of stress in our brain, decreases our level of focus. Whereas if you take a 5-minute break in between back-to-back meetings and allow your brain just to do nothing, you have the same level of stress and focus as when you started your first meeting. So scientifically, it doesn't work. We need our brain to enter the default mode network, which is our kind of most creative, most mind-wandering place to be. And then we're seeing, on the other hand, as we've talked about, languishing, burnout, if we continue on this pathway, we are going to be robot zombies that have no capability of creating or inventing or doing anything new, let alone taking care of ourselves. So I think we're reaching the end of an era, thankfully. And I don't even think it's radical to say that we need to change how we think about ambition, success, and quote unquote productivity. And also what's cool is that the science is there. And I think there's been a much bigger push for it since COVID, which really kind of changed our working styles and our personal values, right?
Some of those words are just so tied up in our worth. And so it's hard to disconnect. In your experience, when you started to learn all of this research and then implement it in your own life, How did you start thinking about work differently?
So I would say when I was working on adulting, just working for myself, kind of managing maybe smaller impact than my goals at Daydreamers, I was really good at setting bounds. Then when I entered the startup space, what I was driven by and what Dupi and I both are driven by every single day is the impact that Daydreamers can make on the world. And when you are starting something that you care so deeply about, first, it's so much fun and so fulfilling to work on personally. Second, it can have so much of an impact on how we all think about the way that we care for our mental health, our physical health, our, societal well-being.
Yeah.
You get really caught up in it. And I would say that my biggest personal lesson has been understanding that the way that I show up in my work is a direct relation to how other people receive the work that I am putting out in the world. So if I am showing up as a frenzied, stressed out, overworked person because I care, that caring does not precede the way that people are receiving this product and this work. So what was really important to me is after spending, a year and a half of working intensely on building Daydreamers, it felt like we were having a baby. That was the level of intensity of work that we were putting into this company and this product. And I think there was a point this year that really forced myself and Dupi and our team to think about how we were showing up and caring for ourselves and how we could sustainably do that so that we could continue to make impact. And I think when you're an impact-driven company, it's really easy to not think about yourself and your own well-being, but it's ultimately the most important thing that we can do. Otherwise the company and the impact wouldn't sustain, right? So it's kind of a backwards way of thinking about it. But I would say since that reckoning, we've implemented everything that we tell Daydreamers members to do, which is take breaks, don't have long meetings, create space to create just for yourself. And we literally live the Daydreamers lifestyle, and it has been the most amazing change. And I think, our organization and our business has been done so much better because we can show up and think more clearly and more productively, I guess.
Do you find that it's slowed or changed the trajectory of the business at all?
Not at all.
Interesting.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, not at all. I think that when you are stressed and chaotic, your work is that way. You end up wasting so much time because you are just worried about things that don't exist. But when you are able to come in clearly and confidently, you get so much more done in a shorter amount of time. And I think you actually are able to make much more long-term decisions.
So tell us a little bit about Daydreamers and just what somebody might experience if they become a member, because personally I was in a state for a period of time where I just felt like I couldn't add one more thing to my plate. And now that I am a member and I'm engaging, I understand that I absolutely have time. It is very easy to fit in, and you make it really, really simple and stepwise. And
well, I'm so glad you got to experience it for yourself. Essentially, the headline of Daydreamers is that we are helping all adults, but specifically non-artists, strengthen their creative health. So when we think about creative health, it isn't just creating art, right? It's not just creating a beautiful painting, but it's really about all of the things that we talked about, being able to express yourself and your emotions, being able to experience awe and wonder, and then being able to think critically and creatively. So we really see it across this spectrum that requires kind of physical expression, creative thinking and connection with others, and then being able to mindfully experience the beauty around you. So that's really what we're striving for at Daydreamers, and we kind of implement it in some unique ways, which, we have an app where we kind of house all of the Daydreamers content, the exercises that are organized based on how much time that you have and what goals that you might have based on what your creative health looks like right now. Mm-hmm. And then we also give people the physical creative tools to actually,
it's so fun because you get a present in the mail. Yes. Like you receive all these tools that I honestly would probably be too lazy to go to the store and get.
Totally. And what I think is really cool, and this is actually like first sharing here, we're pushing out a really big update in early January where right now Daydreamers is associated with different goals and emotional states. So for example, Stephanie, you are on the chill journey, which is kind of helping you feel more relaxed and mindful, and really using your creative practice to change how you feel in your day-to-day. But the big update that we're pushing out is that we're actually going to be changing a lot of the content and organizing Daydreamers based on creative blocks that you might have, which is a lot of the feedback and the findings and the research that we've been doing in this phase of our work. So we've been finding that it's not just that you need to feel more relaxed, but actually what you're working on is reducing perfectionism.
Yes.
And that applies to so many parts of life, right? Like you are not just trying to reduce perfectionism in your creative practice, but at work and in relationships. And I think I'm really excited for the way that this is going to take shape and the different journeys that you could go on, so that creative health isn't just isolated to this typical way we think of creativity, but a way that we show up in the world.
Wow. I'm so excited for that. Yeah. It's funny that you mentioned perfectionism because that's a conversation I was having last night, and it's,
oh my gosh,
I never identify as a perfectionist because I'm not perfect, which is the problem. Like that's like perfectionism that to a T. Like literally. I can't be a perfectionist. Here's a list of 20 things that I need to improve. Totally hit the nail on the head. So that's hilarious. I love that you're switching it because it seems like it'll be a pathway that will enhance self-awareness. Like I understand that I need to chill, but like there's so much more behind that, and you're helping bring that to the surface, and practicing these tools is chipping away and like shifting that path, like supporting our foundation holistically. So I love that.
Totally. Yes. So cool. That's so spot on. And it's actually like what we're doing with creativity, and they're using creativity compared to other mental health practices and well-being practices has some really unique ways and areas that we could work on in our life, right? Like creative practice is so ripe for reducing perfectionism, not only because we have this physical product that we need to like work through what our reaction to that is, but also because it's enhancing mental flexibility. So how we're able to kind of change the way that we think about our outcomes and our end goals. So I think it's just really a cool way to work on these things.
Totally. And what I love about it too is like this is a surefire way to get into that flow state and do so with no attachment to an outcome, because I would never buy a scratch pad and expect that something is going to come of that. Like whereas many other artistic hobbies, I picked up pottery once and I was like bummed because I looked on Pinterest for inspiration and nothing I made looked like the things I saw on Pinterest. So all of a sudden now there's like this negative feeling associated with what was supposed to just be, an outlet, a form of expression, a way to use my hands and like connect with myself in a different way. And so I love that I'm not choosing the art that we're going to create. You're sending me this package and saying, whether you like it or not, like here's a scratch pad, start playing with it, and then it taps you into that flow state that we talked about that otherwise I would be thinking with my logical brain, like, how can I get into that flow state? Like just overthinking it. And this is really alleviating all of that friction and that burden to just almost immediately start experiencing result.
Oh my gosh, yes.
Very
You
cool.
did such a beautiful way of describing what we're aiming to do, reduce friction so that we can feel better,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
This isn't just an amorphous thing, and you can actually track the impact that this has on your creative health. So you can really see what kind of metrics and elements of your psychological well-being it's changing, how it's shifting your mood, and how this habit is really informing and changing your life. So
Yeah.
I think what's really cool is we take a very analytical approach to something that can feel very unclear and amorphous. Obviously, we are like data and science people. So for those skeptics out there, you could really see the impact that it has on how you feel.
So I want everyone to sign up for Daydreamers. I want to
Yeah.
get it for my entire family. I want to get them all scratch pads for their stockings. Like
I'm
everyone can
so
benefit from
happy.
this.
Yeah.
And what are a few free resources if somebody either can't or isn't ready to participate in Daydreamers today? You've mentioned
Totally.
so many easy little steps that people can
Yeah.
take, like starting now for free. So just
Yeah.
maybe a top few of your favorites.
Yeah. So two of them that I use day to day that are like within Daydreamers, but I kind of have made my own now that I use them so often are these concepts called cognitive offloading. So basically our ability to kind of use physical product or kind of get a lot of thoughts that are roaming around in our head into the physical world. So you will find me in pretty much every meeting doodling, using a scratch pad, writing things that don't necessarily make sense on the surface of them, but are allowing me to kind of both enter that default mode network and also reduce the cognitive load in my brain. So I love cognitive offloading, and it's also something that we use within Daydreamers to help you kind of process your emotions in a creative way. And the second thing is odd walks. That is my top favorite thing right now. I actively do not bring headphones on my walks. I used to be obsessed with listening to podcasts and kind of learning as much as possible, but it's extremely important for us to experience awe and savor beauty as a way to send our brain on that positive upward spiral, right? So if we experience even just 20 minutes of awe, so going on your walk and allowing yourself to marvel at the sunset or a flower, it could be the most micro thing, but really living in it is extremely powerful for creativity
Yeah.
and well-being. And then
Amazing.
one thing that I would say is one of our advisors and someone that I really look up to wrote this book called Your Brain on Art. Um, and it came out earlier this year. It was co-authored by a Google executive and a scientist, Susan Magnuson. And it's all about the science of creativity and well-being. So it's a really awesome book. And I think it speaks to a lot of the things that we talk about at Daydreamers too.
I'm gonna have to read that. I'm excited.
Yeah,
Cool, cool.
yeah.
Okay, a resource that you would recommend to the audience.
So I have a lot of book recommendations, but I think the first thing that comes to mind is truly like getting yourself a journal. I feel like being able to see and express your thoughts, innermost thoughts, without clouds or judgment or anyone else seeing it, I think has been the most transformative resource that I've had in my life and career. But I think there's a couple of books that really like stand out to me as well. I'm right now rereading Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, which is this like, have you read that?
No, but it sounds so niche.
Yeah. Well, it's a philosophy book that came out
Okay.
in the 60s, and it's, very much like the Four Agreements in that it's like a journey of travel, but it questions so much of the way that we see the world, how we process things. And I feel like being able to just give yourself space to savor and like live in deep questioning books is so important for kind of pushing the bounds on your own thinking. So I would say that.
I love that.
Top of
And
mind for
just
me.
another really quick one for somebody maybe that you were working with back in the days of Goldman who were experiencing that deep languishing. If you just had one little piece of advice for them, I think there's a lot of people that are experiencing that.
I would say follow your curiosity. Like get back in touch with what you're curious about and continue to follow that wherever it goes.
Yeah. And sign up for Daydreamers.
Yeah, sign up for Daydreamers. Come join us. It's made for people like you and me.
And me.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh my
Amazing.
gosh.
Well, thank you so much. Where can everybody find you? What are your handles where they can also stalk you?
All of my personal handles are katina.bajaj, both on TikTok and Instagram. And that's also my website is katinabajaj.com. And then Daydreamers is Hey, It's Daydreamers on social. And then our website is daydreamers.co.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
This was so much fun.
I know.
What a great way to spend a Friday.
Yes. Thank you, Katina. One last thing before you go. It would mean the absolute world to me if you could tap those cute 5 little stars wherever you're listening. If you just click the show's name on your screen right now, it'll take you to the show's page where you can rate and review with your thoughts. And it is a tremendous deal in the charts so that more people can join this community. I am so grateful.